Welcome back to Industrial Problem Solving. My name is Dave Roysum. In the last 3 clips, we began the problem-solving process with careful definitions. Here, I'm very excited to begin the core of problem solving that begins with data gathering. Of the many sources, we will start with people in this clip. Let's begin by observing how the data gathering process fits into the bigger picture. Many people think that problem solving is a recipe or linear process. Indeed, many formal problem solving methods make this common mistake. Real problem is very seldom linear. Instead, it is iterative. You first gather data, then form a first working theory. Then you gather data specifically to test the first working theory. In the rare case that your first guess as to the first working theory is spot on or good enough, you are done. However, this is seldom the case. You may have to modify the first working theory to better match the now larger data sources you have, and so on. Eventually, you will get either a working theory that is good enough, or you will give up in exhaustion due to lack of some resource like time or money or talent. Perhaps you will give up wisely if the problem is too complicated and no progress is being made. This iterative process of gather data, make or modify a working theory, and so on is known formally as the induction and induction processes. While we will teach logic later on, we will just give an example of troubleshooting a car that won't start. Since determining the physics of a problem is the core of problem solving, we want to have as many tools as possible to do this. In this series of clips, these tools will be roughly divided into the major sections of data gathering, working theory, formal methods, and, my favorite of all, the street smart methods that I most often use. There are many data sources that we will cover. In this clip, we will cover qualitative data sources, namely people. Sometimes these are called anecdotal sources. These will include customers, operators, engineers, and scientists, and finally, the expert authority. Each of these has unique contributions to make, and none should be overlooked. In the next clip, we will look at quantitative data sources. In the case of customer complaints, one should always start there. Indeed, I have refused many assignments to help with customer complaints until I could either talk to the customer rep directly or, much better yet, to the customer himself directly. However, even for internal waste, it might be a good idea to consider customers, if not to also start there. Otherwise, you may reject too tightly or too loosely. Here, we run into our first serious but totally unnecessary data gathering handicap. That is, assuming what somebody tells you about the problem is actually what the problem is. Consider the typical chain of communication. Here, the customer's operator has difficulty running. Whether it is due to man, machine, or material is not relevant at this time. They can blame your raw material, and whether it is design or quality fault is no way changes the beginning of this process. After a long enough struggle, the operator complains to the engineer or supervisor that they are having trouble with this role. If the complaints come often enough, the engineer complains to purchasing, who may complain to the plant manager. She, in turn, complains to your plant manager, who complains to QA, who complains to the engineer, who goes to the operator and says, "What's up?" We recall a children's party game called Telephone and how quickly messages get garbled. A much better, and perhaps the only safe and effective route, is for the operator of your machine to go to the operator of the customer's machine and ask, "What's up?" Engineers from both plants should also talk directly because many problems are technical. Of course, we should keep management apprised because we may need them later when we find out what the problem really is and what the options are. A final recommendation is to autopsy every single return. Don't take a claim at face value that it is defective as described by the customer. To do so may miss some early warning signs. It is possible that you might be paying too much attention to customer complaints if you assume that the customers are a good measure of your quality. For one thing, the threshold of complaint may vary enormously between customers. Also, they may misdiagnose their own problems. Also, they may intentionally or unintentionally misdirect troubleshooting efforts by making claims about competitors that may not be true. Finally, customers might suddenly start complaining much more loudly, even if the quality is the same. They may be fed up. A new manager might have come into power, or they may have a new process that is not as tolerant. In short, don't be lazy and assume that anything the customer says is necessarily correct or complete. In short, and to reiterate the theme of the last slide, you must go to your customer to see what's up. In the nearly 1,000 plants that I've done troubleshooting in, I use 3 primary resources. These sources are the web, the engineer, and the operator. If we had the time, such as during my 2-day troubleshooting classes, I would tell one of 100 stories where the operator was not only a good source, they were the primary or only source of a key bit of information. Without a key bit of information from the operator, we might not have unlocked the problem as quickly or may have failed to unlock it altogether. I make it a point to try and learn from every operator I meet. Sometimes, for any number of reasons, I am unable, but that is usually because of impatience or failure on my part, rather than being an operator who doesn't have something to teach, and that is really quite rare. Engineers and scientists are another obvious source to consider. One advantage for these sources is that they may speak the same technical language as you do, and that can sometimes speed things up. For example, they may have already made the measurements that we need to establish or disestablish cause and effects relationships. Still, as with any source, there are issues to consider. Sometimes the engineer is too busy to have done the homework. Sometimes they are not busy enough, or more accurately, they get stuck on things that don't matter. Sometimes the engineers can even be part of the problem. Your company may have experts in certain areas. Sometimes you may bring in outside expertise because they may have extensive specialized experience or expertise. Even if not, they should provide an independent second opinion. It is not possible to be an expert in more than one very narrow field. Thus, you would not expect a web handler to be an expert in extrusion, or vice versa, even if they have extensive experience in extrusion plants. You should look at the body of published work as examples of where an expert can legitimately claim expertise. Finally, Any or all experts can get it wrong. Many times we experts do what is called a swag, S-W-A-G. That is, a scientific wild-ass guess. That is different than a mere wild-ass guess because there's some science behind it. Those of you who have followed the Dilbert comic will recall the favorite sources of chaos include inept bosses and, of course, consultants. Here are a few of my favorite consultant jokes. Thank you so very much for joining me in this introduction to the problem-solving process. In the next clip, we will continue our exploration of data sources by discussing the art and science of queries. Stay tuned.